Good evening, I'm Chris Parsons and I'll be discussing the Christian ethical positions for and against assisted dying, the terminally ill. For the purpose of this discussion, I'll be using two theories of ethics, consequentialism and deontology. In Genesis chapter 1, we read the story of creation, God creating man in his own image. He thought that his creation was very good. As Christians, we think that there is something sacred about life. This is referred to as the sanctity of life. Messer records that since the 4th century, suicide has been disapproved of. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas held that it was wrong because it was contrary to the natural law. It harms the human community to which a person belongs. It wrongs God, who gives us life and who alone has power over life and death. The Roman Catholic Church teaches that no person has the right to deliberately end the life of another person or his or her own life. However, it also teaches that it is not acceptable to unquestioningly prolong the life of a dying person. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states, whatever its motives and means, direct euthanasia consists in putting an end to the lives of handicapped, sick, or dying persons. It is morally unacceptable. We'll take a brief look at English law. In 2005, Lord Joffe introduced the Assisting Dying Bill for the terminally ill. This was in part a response to the Tony Bland case, and in the light of the Diane Pretty case. Tony Bland remained in a persistent vegetative state after the Hillsborough disaster, and he was allowed to die. Diane Pretty had an advanced motor neurone condition and wanted her husband to help her to commit suicide, as she was incapable of doing it for herself. The court refused her request. She then took it to the European Court of Human Rights, and it was ruled that the right to live did not give the right to die. In 1961, suicide was no longer a criminal offence. And in February 1993, the case of Anthony Bland became the test case for the lawfulness of elective withdrawal of life support in the form of artificial nutrition and hydration in an adult patient in the UK. In May 2006, Lord Joffe reintroduced the Assisted Dying Bill in the light of the Diane Pretty case. The government blocked further readings of the bill. On the 28th of January 2020, Lord Falconer formally introduced a second reading of the bill for the terminally ill. The debate was prorogued by Parliament and awaits a second reading. Professor Robin Gill gave evidence on behalf of the Church of England. His argument was that a change in law must be based on the common good, not the needs or wishes of a few or of an individual. In this debate, the sanctity of human life was discussed. It was argued that life has an inherent value. This encapsulates the belief that God owns my life, not I, and I have, therefore, no right to end it. The church leaders were very divided on the issue of assisted dying after examining Lord Falconer's bill. He wanted to legalise assisted dying, and it was designed only for people in the terminal stages of illness who were suffering unbearably and wanted help to end their own lives. Archbishop Justin Welby and Bishop John Ing spoke against it, whereas Desmond Tutu and Lord Carey were in favour of the bill. However, Lord Carey changed his mind after further discussion. It was recorded in The Guardian on the 15th of July 2014 that this debate about assisted dying was notable in how very little either side appealed to religious arguments. Most arguments were based on personal experience. My interest in this debate came about through having to watch my mother deteriorate with Alzheimer's for 10 years. Her death was a difficult one, and I longed to end her struggle. God created man in his own image. As Christians, therefore, we have a moral obligation to take care of and respect life. Theologian James Gustafson holds the view that life is a gift and it is to be received with gratitude. But if life becomes unbearable, active euthanasia could arguably be an act of neighbourly love. There are arguments for and against assisted dying within the church and its leadership. So how can we as individuals find our way through this dilemma? We've looked at the traditional view of the church leaders, but the next step is to search the scriptures for help. The New Testament teaches that because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, we're no longer bound by Mosaic law, but by the new covenant. Jesus taught that the two most important commandments are to love God and love your neighbour as yourself. This means treating others as we would wish to be treated ourselves, with love and compassion. In Romans, we're told, rejoice in our suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance. And in James, we're told to count it all joy when we meet trials of various kinds, for we know that it is testing our faith, and this produces steadfastness, not always easy to do. Can the Old Testament give us any help? Job states, a person's days are determined. You have decreed the number of his months and have set limits he cannot exceed. There are two instances of assisted dying in the Old Testament. In Judges, we read the story of Abimelech, when a woman threw a millstone at him, crushing his head. But he asked his armorer to kill him because he didn't want people to know that he'd been killed by a woman. And in Samuel, we read how King Saul was about to be killed in battle. So he fell on his own sword and was dying and obviously in a lot of pain. He asked the Amalekite to end his life for him. The Amalekite obeyed and then took Saul's crown to David. David's reaction was very interesting because although Saul's death would make him king, he saw it as a capital offence and the Amalekite was killed. The question is, was the compassionate killing of Saul wrong when he was in severe pain and close to death? Perhaps David saw a far greater threat in one who was ready to break the commandment, thou shalt not kill. The lack of fear of the Lord posed the more serious danger to mankind. Under the Old Covenant set out by Moses, killing was authorized for cases of capital punishment and in the context of a holy war. Particularly vulnerable groups, widows, orphans, aliens, the handicapped, slaves, servants, and the aged, were singled out for protection. Perhaps this has some relevance to the argument about assisted dying, in that the values of these lives could be diminished in society, leading to the slippery slope argument and mass assisted euthanasia. An example of this was the Holocaust in Germany during the Second World War. Karl Brandt, Hitler's doctor, when he was on trial for carrying out euthanasia, used the consequentialist ethics argument that a homicidal act is licit if whatever good effects it produces are proportionate to its evil effects of bringing the death of a human being. Brandt said, my underlying motive was the desire to help individuals who couldn't help themselves. A consequentialist argument would be based on the end result of an action. If the action was seen to bring the greatest good, then it was the right action. The Jews had no autonomous choice, and it was evident to the world that Brandt's action was not for the greater good. Consequentialists also argue that human life is only valuable if the person can exercise rational autonomy. At this point, this argument becomes unhelpful to our overall discussion about assisted dying, as it seems to devalue some lives, such as very young infants, people who are in an irreversible coma, and some with dementia who have not got any autonomy. Kant argued for the idea of self-government of morality by the individual, instead of being obedient to externally imposed laws or religious precept. He expects an autonomous person to behave reasonably. O'Neill, when responding to Professor Gill, argues that a proper understanding of autonomy is the Kantian idea that the rights of the individual always go hand in hand with the duty of the individual to other people. The principle of personal autonomy can be used as a way of protecting certain decisions from paternalistic interference. Several reasons why some may be deemed not able to make autonomous decisions: a sense of being a burden, coercion, external pressure, and depression. At this point, using the principle of autonomy fails in our discussion, as the vulnerable need to be protected. Deontological ethics could be useful here, as it considers moral duties and what is right and good. It's based on rules, principles, and laws such as love your neighbor as yourself, as stated in the Ten Commandments. However, although it could apply the principle of justice in order to protect the vulnerable, it's more rigid and unyielding theory, and it can sometimes be unhelpful when dealing with complex human problems. It seems that we cannot rely on one particular ethical approach in our quest for an answer. I tend to agree with Paul Badham's argument that if we truly believe that God should determine the hour of our death, then we should think that it is as wrong to use medical means to extend life as to shorten it. Medicine has the ability to play God by keeping people alive by means of very sophisticated machinery. Does this reject God as the giver and taker of life, and take away the dignity that God has given to human beings? As there is a great deal of uncertainty about the right and wrong of assisted dying, perhaps we need to think more about how we can best help the terminally ill people in their last stages of life. A group of Christians helped to establish the idea of the hospice. They were set up to enable the terminally ill to end their life surrounded by compassion and without excessive suffering or heroic medical intervention. As death can be a very lonely and frightening thing for many, part of our mission as Christians is to give compassionate and prayerful support to the dying and to their relatives, whether at home, hospital, or hospice. We also need to be prepared to challenge the judicial system when we see God's laws being blatantly contravened. I'd like to finish with some words written by the poet and devout follower of Florence Nightingale, Arthur Clough. He succinctly states my views. Thou shalt not kill, but need not strive officiously to keep alive. Thank you.